Okay, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you. Welcome to this Adventures and Ideas seminar, which features our colleague Gerhard Weinberg. And this seminar, like most of our current programs, is being presented in a hybrid format. So I want to welcome those of you who are watching from home. We have a nice group of people in the room here at the courtyard in Chapel Hill, and we have an equally large and interesting group of people on the Zoom room, wherever you may be. So I'm Lloyd Kramer. I'm a professor in the UNC History Department and the director of Carolina Public Humanities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here as a member of the team that has put this event together, and we're very pleased that you're joining us no matter where you may be joining us from. It's also my pleasure to welcome again one of our most distinguished and experienced UNC colleagues as our speaker, Gerhard Weinberg. This seminar grows out of Professor Weinberg's long analysis of the events and leaders of the Second World War, and it's entitled Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, Erstwhile Enemies, Irksome Allies. A good title. There are a lot of people in our lives a little bit like that, probably, but anyway, there they are. And this seminar reflects some of the research that shaped Professor Weinberg's important book, Visions of Victory, The Hopes of 8 World War II leaders, which was published by Cambridge University Press. And I think the recent events in Ukraine since the Russian invasion have raised new questions about how the anti-Nazi alliance organized itself and sustained its commitment to fight the Nazi menace throughout the Second World War. And I'm sure many of you have had family members who were involved with World War II in some way. Could I just ask, how many of you have a parent or a grandparent or a relative who was involved in World War II? Can you raise your hand? Everybody in the room. This is an amazing historical connection between your lives and the past and the present. So you probably heard more about your own family's experience in the war, but this will be our chance to think about how the people at the very top of the political and military pyramid viewed the war. Many people have worked to organize today's seminar, and I especially want to thank our CPH events manager, Beth Gardner, who is outside. Beth is doing great work. Could we have a little, yes. Thank you, Beth. I hope she can hear us. And I want to thank Paul Bonici for his outstanding organizational work. And he has set up the cameras, the audio, so all of you who are watching online, you are with us in the room because Paul is in the room. So thank you. Many of you have attended previous CPH programs and seminars, so you know we've been organizing faculty seminars and programs for audiences since 1979. And we're going to continue doing that even as technology changes, as formats evolve. And we are always looking for a way to expand our humanities-centered goals and mission to serve a wider population. And our overall goal, I'll say this for our newcomers, our overall goal is to foster dialogues between people in the university and people in all professions and backgrounds outside the university. And I think we have several first-time participants in this CPH seminar. Could I ask you to raise your hand if this is the first time you've been to a CPH seminar? Oh, awesome. We have... Welcome. So we have some cards here that you can take and send to your friends to show them that you care about the humanities. And they have quotes from great writers. This one, for example, is from René Descartes, the famous French philosopher. The reading of all good books is like a conversation with the finest minds of past centuries in which they reveal to us only the best of their thoughts. So the humanities program is a lot like a conversation with the best minds of the entire of human history. Well, that's a little exaggeration, but here. There's one for you. There's one for, this one's from Maya Angelou. This one from Ralph Waldo. Was someone, you're new? I want you to have one as well. You know, the humanities are always evolving, and what we love is continuity as well as change. So anyway, I thank the newcomers for attending, and we'll be recognizing some other people as we go along today. But now I want to briefly summarize the plan for this seminar. Professor Weinberg will give 3 talks. You have the agenda in your packets. Those of you in the room, those of you at home should have received the information via email. These 3 sessions will each last about 75 minutes, and there'll be time for questions after the end of each talk. Those of you who are watching on Zoom can submit questions through the Q&A function on the Zoom link, and Paul and I will convey the questions to Professor Weinberg. We have about a 25-minute break after the first session, and then a 70-minute lunch break after the second. And before I introduce Professor Weinberg, I want to note that each of our seminar sessions will focus on a different leader and the national society that he led during the war. Joseph Stalin in Russia, Winston Churchill in Great Britain, and Franklin Roosevelt, of course, in the United States. And our overall goal throughout the day is to understand how leaders influence and respond to the unpredictable events of a vast war. So our speaker and historical guide for this seminar is Professor Gerhard Weinberg, who perhaps needs no introduction for this group. But you know he has been at UNC since 1974. You've received a brief biography of Professor Weinberg in your registration materials. He is the William Rand Kenan Jr. Professor of History Emeritus at UNC Chapel Hill. And as many of you know, Professor Weinberg experienced German life under the Nazis because he was living in Germany as a young child when Adolf Hitler came to power. His family later moved to England, and they eventually came to the United States. And Gerhard joined the U.S. Army at the end of World War II, and then he went to Japan in the U.S. occupation force. But after he returned to the States, he earned his PhD at the University of Chicago. He taught in the history departments at the University of Kentucky and the University of Michigan before coming to UNC Chapel Hill in 1974. And as you know, he's one of the world's leading scholars on the history of World War II and Nazi Germany. And his numerous books include the monumental work, A World at Arms, a global history of World War II. No one has written a more comprehensive history of the whole war. He has received many prestigious awards and honors for his work, but I want especially to stress his important service over many decades at UNC in training generations of PhD students who have gone out to teach other students across the entire United States and the world. He's an example of how a teacher is like throwing a stone in a pond, and the ripples go to places we never can imagine, but those ripples carry the influence of the teacher. And that's what he's done. So I'm pleased to introduce him now for the opening talk of this seminar, which is entitled Stalin, Peace, War, and Power. My colleague and distinguished historian, Gerhard Weinberg.
Good morning. Let me explain first why in the sequence Stalin is first. He is the only one of the big three who was in control of his country as leader, dictator, elected official, whatever, during the whole war, from the beginning to the end. Winston Churchill was in the cabinet, was drawn into the cabinet by Prime Minister Chamberlain in September of 1939, but he doesn't become prime minister until May of 1940, and in July of 1945, before the end of the war with Japan, the voters in England toss him out of office. And that is at a time when the military and political leaders of all three major powers were pretty sure that the war would continue into 46 and very likely into 47. And of course, Stalin would have been in control in those years as well. Franklin Roosevelt was, in fact, the President of the United States when World War II started, but he died in early April of 1945 before the war with Germany, never mind that with Japan, ended. Stalin was the only one who was there at the beginning and had been there for some years and would be there to the end. What I think is critical for everyone to understand and keep in mind is that Stalin, like all other world leaders, acts on the basis of what he thinks, his beliefs, his assumptions, his hopes. He sees the world as he sees it, not the way you see it, not the way I see it, but the way he sees it. He acts on his beliefs and his assumptions and his fears. And as the world in the 1930s is moving towards the possibility of another war, there are a couple of things which strongly influence Stalin's thinking. The first, and perhaps the most important, is that at the beginning, in the early stages of the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, as a result of which eventually he came to power, the capitalist countries had joined with each other to fight the Bolsheviks. He did not want them to do that again. He was very much afraid that they might. And the conclusion he drew from this concern was that the best thing for the Soviet Union is to have the capitalist countries fight each other. And perhaps as a result of their fighting each other, the Soviet Union could expand by reclaiming some of the territories that it had lost earlier. And maybe, who knows, add to it all. In connection with land that Russia had lost at the end, in the settlement at the end of the First World War, there was, on Stalin's part, a personal involvement in his role as a military leader in the 1920 war with the revived Poland. And I don't think there is any way to understand Stalin's hatred, and that is a polite word, Stalin's hatred of the Poles is in part, I would suggest, a product of his experience in a military campaign in which the Poles won and retained the territory that at that time, we're talking about 1920, that they wanted and kept through the 1920s and 30s. Two other things which he did while running the Soviet Union, in the 1930s, would affect the situation once the Soviet Union was pulled into the war. The first and in some way most dramatic were the purges, which for a number of reasons he instituted in the Soviet Union in the Red Army. Of the 144,000 officers in the Soviet Army in the mid-1930s, in the purges, some 33,000 were either tossed out, put into camps, or executed. And the percentage was higher in the higher ranks. If, as we'll see, the Soviets do very poorly in their war against Finland first and then Germany, one of the main reasons is that they don't have the experienced, trained officers. The other major domestic act of Stalin in the 30s was the insistence on transforming agriculture in the Soviet Union from individual farms to collective farming. Whatever the reasons, whatever the outcome, one of the major byproducts, if you will, of that process of collectivization of agriculture was a famine in the agriculturally most important part of the Soviet Union, namely the Ukraine. That famine kills at least 2 million people and leaves behind, by the end of the 30s, beginning of the 1940s, you will understand a widespread attitude among the people of the Ukraine that nothing could be worse than the continued rule of Stalin. Now, that is the background you need to keep in mind when, in the 1930s, Germany is taking the steps that, in Hitler's view, are necessary, that he has told the German people about, quite frankly, and that builds on something that was, I think it is fair to say, unique to the people in Germany. In all other countries on earth that had been in the First World War, there was, in the 1920s and 30s, a sense, let's not get into such a thing ever again. But by the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, in Germany, a political party that was publicly calling for more wars to expand the country and eventually perhaps control the world, was getting more votes than any other party in open and free votes. Elections, I mean. And you will understand that others got alarmed about this. The British and French, who had been victorious in 1918 in that First World War, were very worried about this rise of Germany and enthusiasm for military activity and expansion, and hoped to get the Soviet Union to work with them to restrain the Germans in the middle of Europe. But Stalin thought that it would be much better for his country if the capitalist British and French fought the Germans and he could watch rather than join either side. Let them fight each other. And by August of 39, the negotiations between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia had progressed to the point where the German foreign minister of the time, Joachim von Ribbentrop, went to Moscow and signed with Stalin a non-aggression pact and a series of secret agreements dividing Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union, all the territories between them. When the Germans start what we generally now think of as the Second World War and invade Poland on the 1st of September 39, first the British and then the French, a couple of days later, declare war on Germany. And about 10 days later, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. You will understand that this leads to the division of Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union along the line that German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop had worked out with Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov when he was in Moscow. There is now a war on. And from the Soviet point of view, this opens a number of other possibilities. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had been parts of Russia before the First World War. Their independence, by a series of procedures that we won't go into now, are annexed, if you will, by the Soviet Union. Finland had also been a part of Russia, had in a series of upheavals and wars attained independence. And when the Soviets demand some territorial concessions from the Finns will make some minimal ones, but not the ones that Stalin wants. So there's a war here from late October 39 to March of 1940. The Soviet Union is at war with Finland. Now, as you, I'm sure, know, this is what you're seeing is only the European part of Russia. And that's already a dozen times larger than Finland. And it's only about a quarter of the total Soviet Union. Why is it that the little country of Finland can stall off and eventually make peace with Stalin in March of 1940? And the answer is that the Red Army has lost its officers, not being killed by the Finns, but being killed by having been killed by Stalin, or having been put into slave labor camps by Stalin. And these officers have been replaced by inexperienced and to a considerable extent untrained new officers. The Finns get peace with the Soviet Union as a result of their effective fighting. And in that, they have to make some territorial concessions, but they get back their access to the Arctic Ocean, and they have to make concessions by pulling back the border from being close to Leningrad and a place further north. I don't want to go into the details now. But the war between Germany, Britain, and France is, to Stalin's happy excitement, continuing. And it is his judgment that Germany is the weaker of these combatants, and therefore he decides to help his new dear friend Adolf Hitler. And he will do things for his dear friend Adolf that he would never dream, after the Germans attack him, of doing for Churchill's Britain or Roosevelt's United States. Let me see if I can get it. Yeah. Two things he does to take just beyond providing the Germans with the oil they need. So that, ironically, when in 41 the Germans invade the Soviet Union, their tanks are for the most part filled with oil that dear Stalin has provided in the preceding 2 years. But he does two other things for them that he would never dream of doing for the Western Allies. He provides the Germans a naval base here in the north on the Arctic at Zapadnaya Litsa Bay. And that provides an access, in the obvious instance, to the Atlantic for the German Navy's submarines. But it is absolutely critical for the Germans when in April of 1940, they invade to occupy Norway and Denmark. It is from this base in the Soviet Union that the German Navy forces that are engaged in the critical point at Narvik in northern Norway, they come from a Soviet base. Another thing he does for his dear friend is the Germans are engaged in a submarine war here in the Atlantic and occasionally send a submarine into the Indian Ocean. But you know, the Earth is round, and getting from Germany into the Pacific Ocean with warships, that's kind of difficult, huh? So Stalin provides icebreakers for a German warship, please note, to go through here and between Siberia and Alaska, go into the Pacific and sink Allied British and French ships. As I said, when he gets into a war with Germany and has Britain and the United States as allies, he would never dream of providing the United States, let's say, with base while he's not involved in the Pacific War, or making it easier for American supply ships to get to Vladivostok by going up this way. The ice is not harder, and going in the different direction doesn't make the work of ice-breaking ships more difficult. It's just he will do things for his dear German friends that he would never do for his new allies. So let's talk about that issue. The Germans have been planning to invade the Soviet Union for quite a while. Excuse me. But the invasion plan is postponed a couple of times. Soviet intelligence, on the whole, provides very substantial details on the German plans. And a Soviet spy in Tokyo attached to Zorge, a German attached to Japanese headquarters, provides details. Churchill gets intelligence on German plans, provides it to Stalin, who tosses it in the wastebasket. Roosevelt gets intelligence on German plans to invade the Soviet Union and arranges for it to be provided to Stalin, who tosses it into the wastebasket as well. In June of 1941, the reality, of course, is that the Germans invade the Soviet Union. And they do so with the alliance of Italy, Romania, and Hungary. At that time, there had been warnings, and there is this curious differentiation in Stalin's reaction to the possibility. on the one hand, he has massive Soviet troops on the new border. But when German reconnaissance planes fly over the Soviet Union to take pictures and see where the troops are and where the fortifications are and collect intelligence, he orders Soviet anti-aircraft not to shoot at them, and the Soviet Air Force not to interfere with the airplanes of his dear friend Adolf. When the Germans therefore strike in June of 1941, they advance considerably, and a factor in this is the Russians military are still learning. They've learned a few things in the Finnish War, war against Finland, but they've got other things to do. But Stalin had assumed that the Germans would primarily head for the Ukraine. And so the heaviest concentration of troops are at the southern part of the front. The Germans had decided, in fact, however, that the main thrust should be in the central front and head for Moscow. They do. But their estimate of the Soviet army, although in part you can say they realized that there were weaknesses, that there were inexperienced officers, etc., and they do advance. And then, since the big push towards Moscow is fast, and their push in the south is more slow, that means in the end what they do is strike to the south and surround an enormous portion of the Soviet extra forces that have been assigned to defend the Ukraine, and they get there anyway. The realities, if you will, are that the Germans win what we might well call substantial tactical victories. They advance, they surround and capture several million Soviet soldiers. But what they do not understand is the reality. It's not just that this country is very large. They could look at a map, they knew that, and that was one of the reasons they wanted it. And they were going to take it all. Hitler was planning during World War II for a new railway system with a railroad track width even wider than the Russian track width, which was somewhat wider than the standard Central and Western Europe railroad track. But one of the major railroads that Hitler was planning went from Berlin to Vladivostok, the Russian port on the Pacific Ocean. That's a long way. And what that meant in the realities of warfare was that although the Red Army lost millions of soldiers, Stalin was able to recruit more, and very quickly people in the areas into which the Germans moved realized that their notion that nothing could be worse than the government they had been enduring was a false assumption. There were governments and people who were worse than what they had been experiencing. And that proved to be especially the case in the Ukraine, where after the horrors of the famine with collectivization, there was much opposition to the regime and emphasis on Ukrainian specialty and nationalism. What they could not quite understand was that the long-term German plan was to do away with all Ukrainians, period, and replace them with German settlers. This was going to be German living space. And even the most minimal steps in this direction that the Germans began to take as they invaded and conquered disillusioned most, not all, but most of the Ukrainians about the possibility of their getting some independence and running their farms the way they wanted to, etc., etc. Contrary to their prior thought, there were possibilities worse than what they had experienced. What happens is that the Soviet people increasingly rally to the regime. And Stalin at least begins to realize and engage his earlier, the impact of his earlier purge of the officers in the army. And those who hadn't been killed but had been sent to labor camps, substantial numbers are released, returned to service, and in some instances promoted. The perhaps most dramatic example of this is a high-ranking officer by the name of Rokossovsky, who eventually, after release from camp, ends up in World War II as a marshal of the Soviet Union. In other words, Stalin isn't yet listening to his top military aides, but he is releasing substantial numbers of those who had been purged but had not been killed. Those obviously could not be brought back, but a substantial number are. you will understand, I think, that he also orders, and a number of people leading positions assist in the evacuation of industry, facilities, and workers as the Germans advance into other parts further east in the Soviet Union. And these evacuated industries and workers enable him to keep his army supplied with equipment. And that procedure, if you will, is assisted by the fact that the British are very pleased that the Germans have now tackled the Soviet Union, and that the bulk of the German army and the majority of the German Air Force is headed east. I will say some things about their war with Germany in the summer of 1940 when I speak about Churchill. But what you have to realize is that from the perspective of the people in England, the turn of the Germans to the east, to fighting in the east, and very quickly learning the hard way that the Soviet Union doesn't collapse in 6 weeks as they thought it would. That, from the British point of view, means that we got a new ally and start sending aid. And the United States, I will talk about this more when we discuss Franklin Roosevelt, also, if the Germans or the Japanese want to attack the United States, it's nice to have an ally already fighting the Germans, and who might someday or other also fight the Japanese, but at least right now they're fighting the Germans. Because if the Germans, as they have been saying in public, and as Hitler's been saying, are going to take over the world, that by definition will include the United States. So we have been helping the British who are fighting the Germans, and so we too begin to assist the Soviet Union. There are two important ways this is done. I have to do some map switching. There are, not far from, a little further east, from where the Soviets had provided a base to the Germans, is the town of Murmansk on the Arctic Ocean. And convoys then go from Britain there, and eventually ships go from the United States there. The Germans, you will understand, try to interfere with these convoys. And for a while there, in the July of 42, after one of the convoys had big trouble, this is the famous PQ-17, I don't want to get into the technical disaster issues, but there is a disaster, so there is an interruption. But it is not the only way that the Western allies can assist the Soviet Union. The British and the Russians proceed to occupy what had once been called Persia, and at the time we're talking about is called Iran. The Russians do it from the north, and the Brits do it from the south. And at least for an obvious time in 1941, the Germans fighting here are in no position to interfere with aid from Britain or the United States going to Iran, and then by train across Iran to the Soviet Union, and then to wherever what is being shipped the Russians wanted. Okay? The other way in which they can do it is, keep in mind, the United States has a coast as west as well as east, and ships from there can cross the Pacific and go to Soviet ports on the Pacific, particularly Vladivostok, that I mentioned earlier. And they can also go, please note, Alaska is in fact quite close to the Soviet Union. Am I making myself clear? I mean, on this map you don't see that, but it happens to be the case. And so some of the aid goes from Alaska by ship to Soviet ports, and a substantial portion of the American airplanes, both military and transport, which are provided to the Soviet Union, are flown from the American Northwest to Alaska, okay, and then are flown from Alaska to airports in the Soviet Union. I don't want to suggest that there are never any problems with this, but the reality remains that both Britain and the United States provide substantial aid. And one has to recognize that in certain regards, this is very important. The United States sends over 100,000 trucks. Lots of things go from Britain and the United States to the Soviet Union to assist in its fight. The reality of the fighting is that in the winter of 41-42, as the Germans are pushing to Moscow, they get stopped and they get beaten back. They have surrounded Leningrad, but they haven't taken either city. In 42, the Germans are going to have to go at it again. And just as Stalin had miscalculated where the main German thrust would be in 1941, he would again miscalculate in 42. He would assume that the Germans would again try for Moscow. But the Germans Hitler has quite different plans. And that is the Ukraine, the Caucasus, to get the oil wells, the southern part of the front. But since those are enormous distances and the front will get longer, in 42, the Germans are more dependable on their military allies. The Italians have an army on the Eastern Front. The Hungarians have an army on the Eastern Front. The Romanians have 2 armies there. So they push. On the map that you are looking at, the line is how far the Axis powers got in 1942, okay? And although the map doesn't show it, the Maikop oil fields are here, so they did get to one of the oil fields. But they were very much afraid that if they, as they planned to keep going, Baku, the main ones are down here, that the Russians could then cut them off. So a force, while they're pushing here, they push towards Stalingrad. By this time, the Russians know more, and what they do is strike on both sides, in part through Romanian and Hungarian troops and German troops, and surround the German army that had gotten into Stalingrad. And Hitler will not allow it to break out, and the Russians won't let it break out. The Germans supply it for a while from the air, but then the Soviets crush it. From there on, I think it is safe to say, the Red Army advances and pushes forward to a line roughly like this. While this is going on, Stalin is thinking of making peace again with the Germans. Starting in 42, well into 43, he is periodically in contact with the Germans through the fact that Sweden is neutral officially, which means that in the capital, in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, there are German diplomats and there are Russian diplomats and British. I mean, everybody has their diplomats in Stockholm. And Stalin tries. Now, there is, I have to tell you, a very serious issue about what he was willing to do, because the relevant records from Stalin's personal files were kept by the Soviets, and they're still in Moscow. But contrary to the advice that I gave to all Soviet scholars I met at international conferences, that these needed to be microfilmed, because the paper, the wartime paper, is deteriorating. And eventually those who have custody and are protecting them won't be able to read them any more than anybody else, because the paper will have deteriorated to the point. Nothing of the sort was done. So that when in more recent times, at least for a while in the 90s, there was an opening of some records. A lot of that was important. But these papers of Stalin, nobody can read. What we do know is that he was well into 43. We don't know quite the last date, but it's well into, from 42, well into 43, willing. And the Japanese were urging the Germans to make peace with Russia. And then Mussolini, the Italian leader, was urging them to make peace. But Hitler invariably said no. And what I think is interesting, because for this we do have records, is that eventually in 43, one German government official who was personally close to Hitler, they got along very well, was Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. And he urged Hitler to make peace with Stalin. We know this, the contemporary records are clear. And Hitler told Goebbels that since he had to insist on Germany getting the Ukraine and the Caucasus oil fields, and Stalin would never agree to that, there was no point in trying to negotiate with the Soviet Union. And that, in this regard, Hitler was undoubtedly correct. That is, Stalin might have made considerable concessions, but giving away the Ukraine and the Caucasus oil fields, he never would have. And as long as that's what they insisted on, because that's what Hitler wanted, there was no point trying to negotiate in Stockholm or any place else. Stalin is not only thinking of making peace with his former dear friend Adolf, but he is urging the British and the Americans to open a second front in Western Europe. They are much too polite to tell him that there had been one, and he had helped Germany destroy it. But the reality was that they weren't quite ready. When, in 1944, and I'll come back to this second front issue when we discuss Churchill and we discuss Roosevelt, when they do it, as I am sure you know, on the 6th of June, 1944, in Normandy, Stalin had promised them to make an offensive on the Eastern Front. And on the 22nd of June, running on to August 19th, the Soviets have the biggest new offensive of the war, named Bagration after an earlier general. And in this operation, the Soviets destroy the German Army Group Center. They do have already cut off this peninsula. The Germans are still trying, but they have taken most of the Baltic states. They are moving into Poland. And to reassure his people, Stalin has in Moscow on the 5th of July, 1944, 57,000 German prisoners of war marching through Moscow for the people to watch. We're winning. It's kind of on the obvious side. And from the new lines accomplished by the big summer offensive that I mentioned, the Red Army pushes into Germany starting in October of 44 and onto Berlin, where, as you know, they take over in 45. I have to say a brief word about the entrance, eventually, of the Soviet Union into the war in the Pacific. They have promised the Americans and the Brits that they will do that, but Stalin has been very careful about this because he's been moved a good many of his Far Eastern troops to the front in Europe. But now, as things have gone right, as I am sure you know, the United States drops atomic bombs in Japan, the first one on Hiroshima, and then when the Japanese don't surrender, a second one on Nagasaki. But at this time, the Soviet Union enters the Pacific War. Stalin has them move into Manchuria, and very quickly, the southern half of the island of Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and is getting ready to move into the northern island of Hokkaido. We tend to forget that one of the results of our dropping the atomic bombs and forcing Japan to surrender is that there is no Allied land type invasion of Japan as there had been of Germany, and there is therefore no Soviet zone of occupation in part of Japan the way it happened because the Germans didn't surrender until the overwhelming majority of Germany was occupied by American, British, French, and Russian troops. Okay? So there's, as I said, no Soviet zone of occupation. A couple of review comments, and then it'll be your turn. The Germans had captured over 5,700,000 prisoners of war. The overwhelming majority, more than 3 million of them, are either killed or die, and a minority get to go home. The Soviet Union Red Army captures 3 million German prisoners of war, but over 2/3 of them, more than 2 million, eventually go home. Of about 250,000 Polish prisoners of war that they had taken when they invaded Poland back in 1939, about 20,000 are killed at Stalin's order on the 5th of March, 1940. Others are deported. And I will come back to this, but Stalin agrees to Churchill's notion that the way to handle the Polish issue, where the Russians want their eastern Poland back, is to move Poland west, to give them the Poles the eastern part of Poland, and to give the Poles East Prussia. But because Roosevelt has been insisting on maintaining the independence of the Baltic states, East Prussia is divided, and the northern portion is to go to the Soviet Union, and it belongs to Russia now, as a way of keeping the Baltic states, at least for the time being, in the Soviet Union. With his advance in the West, the Soviet Union can acquire a piece of Romania, the eastern part of Poland, as I said, the Baltic states, and establish Soviet-type governments in Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Hungary, and in Germany, you have the Russian occupation zone, which becomes then the East German state, something that never happened with Japan for reasons I explained a few minutes ago. So you have two Germanys for 50 years before they get together again. But that's where the Red Army had moved in 1945 in its advances after Operation Bagration. What one needs to just keep in mind that this is the war that the people in the Soviet Union will remember. Way over 20 million, probably around 23 million, died or were killed in it. And the memory of Stalin focuses at least as much on his being the victor of the war, perhaps more than of the horrors that he had personally directed and imposed on the people of his country. And that memory continues today. And if I can make a personal remark, it does seem to me that the current dictator, Putin, is very much influenced by this and thinks or imagines that he is Stalin reborn. One of those things. Now it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we can see that history lives on. So we're going to open the questions. I'm going to circulate with the microphone so people can hear us at home. Joe?
In 1943, Stalin demanded is the word that I read, that the Allies invade Normandy. Stop with the preparations already and invade Normandy in 1943. Some people think he had a good point in that you can never prepare enough, but that the German coastal defenses were much softer, and that actually would have been advantageous. your point, your comments on that point specifically, and in general, how good was Stalin with military strategy and tactics?
Well, whether or not, there's no question that the Americans have been pushing and pushing and pushing for, and I'll be discussing that in my next two lectures, for an invasion across the channel. But you must recognize that the United States was, at the time we are talking about, not in a position to do this by itself. And as long as the British were not going to do it, and Churchill, in fact, hoped never to have to do it, and had to be kicked, shoved, pushed by the Americans, whether it would have been easier in 43, we'll never know. But there was no possibility realistically of doing it by ours, that is the United States doing it by itself. So one can imagine all kinds of possibilities and alternatives. And the various fronts influenced each other. No lack of argument on this. But there were some things one could not do. And this was one of them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move over here. Brent, and then
I've got one question with three parts. Number one, was Hitler's invasion of Russia the worst strategic decision he ever made? The second part would be, if he would not have invaded the Soviet Union, well, the second part is, if that wasn't the worst one, what was the worst one? And then third would be, if he didn't invade them, could he have taken Great Britain by putting all the forces on one side of the war together?
I'm sorry, can you summarize?
okay, the
what
first question was
is? I'm
Hitler's
sorry.
invasion of Russia, the worst military decision he ever made. The second question was, no, what was the second? Could he have taken England if he had not invaded Russia? But there was a third one. What was the worst, if invading Russia was not Hitler's worst ever military decision, was there a worse one?
Was there a what?
A worse decision than invading Russia militarily? But that's a lot of questions. So let's just start with the first one. Was invading Russia the worst military decision Hitler ever made? Why would he do that?
Well, he was always going to do that. This was not some kind of a novel last-minute choice. The original plan had been to strike in the West already in late 1939, so that the invasion of the Soviet Union could take place in the spring of 1940. If you look at the map for a moment, you will see very quickly, just a moment, I'll show you one that will do this. If you look at this world map, if your project is to expand Germany massively, there's only one way you can do it. You can head west, but then you fall into the English Channel. That's no distance at all. But the other way, that's where the land is. And so from the very beginning, this was where Germany was going to acquire the Lebensraum, living space. It wasn't by occupying huge countries like Luxembourg.
But could he have conquered England if he had not invaded Russia? What do you think?
Well, he wanted to and gave the orders and the plans, but they were defeated. The Battle of Britain was in many ways one of the most important of the Second World War. And I have a personal memory because I was in England at the time. The Brits had, in the period, ironically, between the Munich Agreement and the outbreak, they're declaring war on Germany in 1939, substantially built up their production of fighter planes, Hurricanes, and especially now, then the new Spitfire. And there was not the slightest sign of British substantial public dissatisfaction with the governments fighting the Germans and defending against an invasion. You can't walk across the English Channel. You know, that's one reason it took us quite a while before we could do it.
That's right.
And the Germans hoped to do it and collected transport ships in ports in the Netherlands and France. The British bombed and destroyed quite a few of them. But I think one has to defeat in the Battle of meant that they couldn't invade. If they had tried it under the circumstances, it would undoubtedly have led to a military disaster for the Germans. And they didn't want that. They would have been perfectly safe in the East because Stalin was not about to do anything nasty to his dear friend Adolf. But the reality was they were defeated in the plans and attempts to do exactly what you said they should have tried to do. They tried and failed. Sometimes in war that happens.
So, Gerhard, we have two questions back here. I'm going to try to get these two in before the break.
Okay, one quick point, and you'll probably get to it in the next session. Hitler's worst mistake was probably declaring war on the United States after Pearl Harbor. The second is from the War College studies, and Navy War College, not Army. We didn't have the landing craft to be able to do an invasion of France. We struggled the whole time, first North Africa, and then Italy, and then France. 2 French invasions, by the way. We forget the second one in the south. Shuttling landing craft around and making enough of them.
Would you repeat? I cannot.
I think they were comments, perhaps more than questions. Of the one was about 1943. We didn't yet have enough landing craft to actually pull off an invasion in 1943. And the second, he was answering, I guess, the question, what was Hitler's greatest mistake? And he's suggesting declaring war on the United States was Hitler's greatest military political mistake.
And I will come to that in a moment, but keep in mind that that was the only way that he could get the Japanese into the war, by promising to do that and repeating that promise just before they launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. So I'll come back to that issue when I discuss Roosevelt, but because there's a race there between Hitler and Roosevelt. But what was the other question?
I think it was more of a comment that maybe we didn't have enough landing craft in 1943 for a full-scale amphibious assault in Normandy. We were still developing those craft.
It wasn't just that. It was that the British weren't going to do it.
The British weren't on
And
board.
we were not going to do it without the Brits.
So we have a question here.
It seems obvious that Putin's goal is still to cause dissension within the capitalist countries and to gain more land. What can we as Americans learn from what happened in World War II to help protect us and the world against Putin's current goals?
So the question is, Putin, if he's replicating, in fact, what Hitler did, I think, more than what Stalin did, what can we do now to make sure Putin doesn't achieve these goals? How can we sustain the opposition to Putin that the Allies sustained against Hitler?
Well,
What can we learn?
That's a very good but difficult question, because what you have is a developing division in our own government with increasing numbers of Republicans thinking of Putin as their dear ally against the Democrats in internal politics. But as long as the current administration remains in, they are helping the Ukrainians fight. You may have noticed that the Speaker of the House has just announced that when the Ukrainian president arrives, he cannot speak to the Congress. Mm-hmm. Now, given this evolving differentiation in this country, it's a very difficult situation. Mm-hmm. And it mirrors, in a small way, what happened in the late 30s and early 40s, when there were people like Lindbergh who thought that Adolf was a nice guy. We should stay on good relations and not help those wretched Brits and evil Russians to fight them. One of those things.
So you can't separate the politics from the military strategy.
No.
But it sounds like you're suggesting that our support for Ukraine is every bit as important as the support for the Brits and the Soviets was in 1941-42.
Yes, in a way it is.
Yeah.
Because
that's what we can learn.
If you will look at it for a moment from the Russian point of view, they are fighting a war. And however which way it goes, a few miles or kilometers this way or that way, that does make taking on another one very difficult for Putin. And so we just have to wait and see.
I'm apologizing because I know we have a question in the back, and one came in online about Stalin's willful blindness toward what Hitler was doing. But we'll come back to this in the next session. I want to make sure we have enough time for a good break. So I want to thank you for taking us through the Soviet Union. Thank you very much, Gerhard. And we will break until about 11:20. Those of you watching online, stay with us. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Thank you very much.